Hi, and welcome to another edition of Newsmakers Journal of the Vaccine Year. I'm Jerry Roberts. It is Friday, July 2nd. Happy holidays. And we are delighted to be joined by my colleague and friend, Melinda Burns, Greek journalist. Thank you for joining us today. Those of you who don't know, Melinda has covered policy, public policy, planning, politics, all kinds of news since 1985 in Santa Barbara County. For the last 5 years, she has been pioneering the Santa Barbara business model of journalism, which is you work tirelessly as a community service rather than for money. And the last year and a half, she's been covering the cannabis story in Santa Barbara, which we're going to talk about today. Melinda, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us. Um, you spent a couple of years covering the fallout from the debris flow in Montecito, of course. And then about a year and a half when the pandemic began, started covering cannabis. Why, of all the stories that are either undercovered or uncovered in Santa Barbara, did you pick that?
Well, I could see that the very strapped local press corps was completely swamped and overwhelmed covering the pandemic on top of all the other local news. And it seemed to me that the cannabis story was such a big story for this county. The advent of a very big and powerful and county changing industry, it certainly seemed that we needed to have somebody on the beat, if not 10 people on the beat. And so I volunteered.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
And
de facto.
well, it's the kind of story when we worked together at the paper, we used to call a perceptual scoop, which is to say there's a huge story hiding in plain sight. And as you say, the strapped local press corps, I mean, kind of does event coverage or sometimes meetings, just kind of covers little things, but it's a huge story that affects land use planning. It affects, I think, the quality of our politics, certainly. It affects agriculture, everything. Uh, what is different about the way that the cannabis industry has been treated as a land use matter? And of course, Santa Barbara County has had a very strict regulatory and land use approach to industries such as the oil industry. What's different about this?
Well, I think that what has struck me throughout, and I wasn't paying much attention in 2018, covering the debris flow, I wasn't paying much attention to cannabis or, the run up to the vote in February of 2018 on the ordinance. So I was surprised and am surprised by how wide the door was open to the industry. And I think that it has surprised a lot of residents also that there aren't more restrictions on such a big and sort of unknown industry in this county. But right now there are 3 votes on the Board of Supervisors to keep the doors open pretty wide. And that has been,
Dos Williams, Steve Lavanino, and Greg Hart.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And very recently that position has been confirmed and upheld in the courts. So I think it's been pretty frustrating to a number of residents for those reasons.
Yeah, and just to recap, 2016 we had Proposition 64 in the statewide ballot, which legalized recreational marijuana in California. And then acting as a quote unquote ad hoc committee, Supervisors Williams and Lavanino advanced this sweeping ordinance, which nobody, ever voted for at a time, I think, when the community was really focused on the debris flow and the tragedy from that. They operated in semi-secret. The grand jury report, of course, found that lobbyists for the industry had quote unquote unfettered access. And I think what has been, troubling to a lot of people is if you look at the EIR for the ordinance, the first thing it says is not, we're going to protect, the health and safety of people. We're going to try to, integrate this in a safe way, but it says, we are going to develop a robust and economically viable legal industry. They essentially implanted an industry. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, I think that in one of the hearings for the recent ruling in Superior Court, which favored the industry, the lawyer for the one of the citizens groups that's filed a number of lawsuits against the cannabis industry pointed out that there were something like 12 significant environmental impacts that were listed in the programmatic EIR coming from cannabis. And we're seeing a lot of those play out right now, including the smell, the concentration of the industry in certain places and so on, though not to the degree that people expected. And he said he didn't think he'd ever seen so many significant environmental impacts being overridden for any developer. And I think, and of course, this was an umbrella environmental impact report for the entire industry, so that each grower did not have to do one for his or her project.
Yeah, I mean, in your reporting, I think you are extremely conscientious in avoiding the kinds of adjectives and adverbs that I use wildly, and trying to get both sides in there while giving a voice to members of the community who really have felt shut out by the lack of transparency and the secrecy that's going on with this. Let's break it down a little bit. Talk about CARP and the concerns of people in CARP and what's happened there.
So in Carpinteria, there is no outdoor cultivation in the sense of an open field or a cultivation under white plastic hoops like you would see up north. In Carpinteria, it's in greenhouses, and it's mostly in old greenhouses built 50 or 60 years ago for the flower industry. And a lot of those, not all, but many of those flower greenhouses have now converted to cannabis. And it means that there is a year-long harvest happening in those greenhouses. In other words, it's almost like a wave. You plant the plants at one end of the greenhouse, and by the time they're being harvested, there's another harvest coming right up behind them. So it sort of progresses through the greenhouse all year. And the harvest time is particularly when people notice the skunky smell or fumes. People have called it fumes, stench, stink, skunky odor of cannabis. And these greenhouses have open roof vents so that they're periodically opened to the air, and that smell comes out. There are pockets, I think, that persist in Carpinteria, all of the decision makers keep hearing about it at the hearings. They call Foothill Road in Carpinteria now Cannabis Row, and they refer to the triangle of Foothill, Casitas, Villarreal, and Nidaver as kind of a rectangle, the rectangle of cannabis, because that is where a lot of the greenhouses are. And you can see that if you go just a little bit above into the foothills, you can look down and see it, and particularly at the western end of the Carpinteria Valley. So we have pockets of smell at the Polo condos and in La Mirada, which is above, it's a cul-de-sac community above Foothill, slightly higher up. Kate's School, which is over by Casitas Pass Road, looking down on some greenhouses there. All along Foothill, you can catch whiffs as you're driving along. That complex nearest the high school, there have been complaints there. Hundreds of complaints have been filed in the last few years.
And really, virtually nothing has been done in response, correct?
You know, I would say that I have seen progress in the technology. You have the first generation of technology, which is these systems which were built for landfills that are being used now on most of it. We don't know for sure, but we think most, if not all of the greenhouses that are operating. And that's a system that actually emits kind of a thin mist, a mist of vapor into the air that neutralizes the cannabis smell. And instead you smell something like supposedly citrus or pine. Many people say it smells like a laundromat, and many people say, or some people say that it irritates their lungs worse than the cannabis smell. So you have that happening at a lot of greenhouses. And then the newest technology that has come in, starting late last year, are the carbon filters or scrubbers that are placed inside the greenhouses. So now we're not talking about neutralizing a smell that has already left the greenhouse. We're talking about scrubbing a smell inside the greenhouse before it leaves. And that technology is being tested, I think, right now in some greenhouses. I don't hear that from the growers themselves so much as people who have worked with them to install these things and see whether they work. Well, and they have been, they've been required in some instances in voluntary agreements with growers who are trying to do the right thing.
But again, it seems to me that sort of the big story is that this has generally favored the growers. And we should say that there's a wide range of growers. There are very conscientious companies, individuals who are trying to do the right thing. And then because the ordinance empowered this quote unquote legal non-conforming status, you have bad actors as well and people who could care less. So it's just kind of like the Wild West out there.
Well, it's just very hard to get a grip on the whole picture because no one knows what the whole picture is. All of the greenhouses claim to have been cultivating medical marijuana back in pre-2016. And based on that, we're allowed to continue cultivating. And as we've seen, the court just upheld expansion of these very small grows into larger grows under a legal non-conforming status until they get their permits. And they're all not just now coming in for permits. So it's only now that some of the conditions are being put in place on these operations.
What about wine country? It's been the industry implanted by Doss Williams and Steve Levanino has been a major disruptor of the wine industry, has it not?
Well, that's what they are afraid of. There's something like 800 acres of cannabis that's proposed or already approved or operating in the Santa Rita Hills, which is a federally designated viticultural area, made famous by the movie Sideways, which brought a lot of additional wine tourism to the region. And there's a couple dozen tasting rooms up there, 60 different wine operations, a scenic place that people like to travel through and spend time at wineries, getting to know the area and associating the wine with a particular region. And of course, the advent of cannabis into that same region has really made the winemakers fearful on several accounts. The wine tasting rooms with the smell of cannabis is a problem. That's already happening. In Buellton, which is downwind from most of these operations, you have a number of wineries right there in the city. And here again, these are outdoor grows, so it's not a year-long harvest. It is a twice-a-year harvest, spring and fall. Or I guess early summer and fall. And so the wind carries the smell into the city and into those tasting rooms. That has happened. So vendors very worried about that. They're also worried about something that is disputed science, really, whether the volatile compounds that that are emitted by cannabis and make up this smell would land on their grapes, their premium grapes, and affect the quality of the wine that they make. And at every hearing, they're dueling studies on these issues. And Planning Commission has supported an independent study by the county to determine whether this is in fact a real threat. And I would say that the Board of Supervisors has not wanted to do it.
No, and based on your reporting, the Planning Commission has just become sort of a token stop. I mean, they've been consistently overruled in a number of procedural votes. Most importantly, the conditional use permit issue by that three-member board of the 3 members of the Board of Supervisors, led by Doss Williams, the puppet of the industry. And I mean, is that different from what you've experienced in the past? The way the Planning Commission is just kind of completely disregarded?
Yeah, I would say that that's been surprising and very frustrating, I think, for the commission, especially on the problem of odor. And one way that they sought to bring it more under control was to have a conditional use permit that would allow the board to impose more conditions. And those could have been, for example, buffer zones, larger buffer zones between what we call traditional agriculture, such as vineyards or avocados and cannabis. It could have been more it could have been buffer zones in Carpinteria, also larger zones between cannabis and schools or residences. The problem in Carpinteria being that they're right there in the backyard of residences in some locations and across the street from schools. Or there could have been per property caps, Humboldt County, for example, has very low caps per 20-acre parcels. I think it's something like 6 acres is all you can have in Humboldt County, unless you have a property that's 320 acres in size. And in Humboldt, they also have a rule where it's only a certain number of acres per person. So no piling on of licenses. There were just a huge number of restrictions that could have been implemented here to avoid some of the unintended consequences that have arisen.
Yeah.
Pesticide drift is kind of a very complicated issue that has come up. Pesticide drift is when you're spraying your crop and some of it lands on the property or the crops next door. Maybe the wind carries it there. Maybe your plane wasn't flying exactly within your boundary or whatever. It wound up there. And of course, now cannabis is practically zero tolerance for pesticide, and it's a multi-million-dollar crop. Well, so any contamination would be a huge problem. And of course, pesticide drift is illegal. So that is what the cannabis side is always pointing out, rightfully, that it is, and it's illegal to spray on your neighbor's property. But these situations have caused a lot of friction, both in Carpinteria with avocado growers and in the North County with vintners.
Yeah.
And we saw the difference. CUP, we just had an example of the difference there. One project.
Conditional use permit, CUP.
Yeah, conditional use permit. Many more conditions placed on one project than a project that came up just a couple of weeks ago, which was something like 65 football fields in size. And there was, what seems to be happening is that the vintners, in some cases, are entering into agreements with the cannabis growers, in which the cannabis growers agree not to sue them, but they have certain rules and regulations about spraying from the vintner side. So it's what's happening is that because the board of supervisors has not taken a high regulatory profile, people on the ground are kind of left to fend for themselves, and that includes the vintners and avocado growers, and it includes the residents who find themselves next to a cannabis operation in Carpinteria.
Well, it was a year ago this week that the county grand jury issued a really report that really savaged the ordinance and the board, and for the way they did it the thrust of it was this was not a balanced approach. They didn't say, oh, here's a new industry we really ought to think about how to be careful about it. They just quote unquote opened the floodgates, according to the grand jury, on it. And I just want to read you one sentence from that report. It says the action taken by the Santa Barbara County Board of Supervisors to certify the development of a quote robust cannabis industry as the primary objective of the cannabis ordinance has altered the quality of life in Santa Barbara County, perhaps forever. Now, the board just dismissed and tried to memory hold this report, but do you agree with that they have altered the quality of life in Santa Barbara County?
I would say that the people in Carpinteria who live near cannabis and are smelling it would say that it has, yes, definitely altered their quality of life. The vintners up north are worried that it will alter their, that will affect their business. They believe that it is already affecting their tasting rooms in some locations. And it's just, in some cases, very hard to know what's ahead because many of these operations are not in the ground yet. And we don't know the extent of, for example, there was a voluntary agreement between a cannabis greenhouse grower and the coalition, one of the citizens coalitions, for a lot of carbon filters and other measures last November. That operation won't be really on the ground for a couple of years. So will the carbon filters work? We don't know. Now they're requiring them in processing buildings, and those are closed buildings. Most of the critics of the industry in Carpinteria would like to see the whole industry in sealed buildings in Carpinteria. Up north, the Farm Bureau would tell you the same thing. But we really don't know. Will the open fields of cannabis create a much worse problem for Buellton, even if they're 8 miles away upwind? Will the smell travel all that distance? Will it affect the quality of the grapes? We don't know. And it's like we're having to invent controls on the industry as we go. And we already know that people are, yes, the quality of their lives is being affected, and it's been going on for years, the smell in Carpinteria.
And then another point I just want to touch on, the argument that Lavanino particularly always makes, we're going to have this great revenue flow, so much money coming in. I mean, there's a couple problems with that. One is, most of the people who are growing marijuana aren't registered with anything, but the revenues are now, $15 million or something like that. But which is just nothing in this, budget, which is over $1 billion at a time when one of the growers in Carp just basically sold part of his business for $500 million. It's a massive industry, and they're paying very little, partly because the supervisors put this gross receipts tax system in place. But again, I'm troubled by, kind of the local media such as it is, which is, understaffed and overworked, kind of celebrates it, is spun about this all the time, but it's really not very much money at all. And most of it's going to enforcement of the ordinance anyway. What's your view on that?
Well, property taxes make up something like 92% of the general fund. And if you just look at the general fund, which is where the discretionary money gets allocated out of the county, something like 4% is sales tax and maybe 4% is cannabis. Might be a little bit more than that. But most of it's property tax. Yeah. And some of the cannabis money, about a third, goes for enforcement. And the sheriff's department has asked 2 years in a row now for another enforcement team of 6 people, but the supervisors have turned that down. Something else to look into.
And nobody voted for this, Melinda. People voted for Proposition 64, but nobody, there was never the question put before voters, do you want cannabis to be a major industry that disrupts people's health and other agriculture products that, introduces this sleazy politics around the county? uh, raises questions about people's ethics. I mean, that question was never put before voters. So this was just a wholesale implementation.
I think that other counties have proceeded extremely cautiously. And I think that, you know, Santa Barbara County has always been very much of an agricultural county. It's a very good place to grow things. We have a high desert community where carrots and alfalfa basically strip mined the groundwater basin. That's Cuyama Valley. So you can grow even in the high desert.
What about the water? That's a good question. Is cannabis a water intensive crop?
It's not as water intensive as alfalfa or carrots by a long shot. And the problem up in the Cuyama Valley, where carrots are strip mining that groundwater basin, is that the basin is in terrible overdraft, and even putting cannabis in on ranch land is being challenged. So I think that you get, different opinions in the agricultural community about this. For example, the vintners will say that they need to be in the region that they're in because it is very particularly good for grapes, whereas you can grow cannabis anywhere.
Right.
But on the other side, the cannabis growers are going where the growing is good.
Yeah. All right. Well, and that whole water thing is a whole nother show we can talk about. And obviously we're in a 1,000-year drought, and things are not good. But let's just talk about the journalism for a minute. And I mentioned at the start that you're doing all this work as a community service, and you make it available to all of the major outlets locally, to the Independent and Newshawk and NetHat and KYT. I mean, when we worked together at the paper, there were 65 people in the newsroom who were covering all this stuff. And now, maybe 15, 20 people, if you add up everybody all together. And so, it's kind of a sad reflection that, you're the one who's, kind of assigned yourself this huge story, which, we might have 2 or 3 or 4 reporters covering. What's that like? What's the challenge of doing that?
Well, I just feel like I could use some help. It's there's just taxes is one thing to cover. The enforcement is another. Land use. What about the labor force?
Campaign contributions.
I mean, it was sort of eye-opening that the grand jury must have done a public records request, or I'm not sure how they work, but they got a lot of information that no reporter dug up.
Right, about how the lobbyists had direct access to the board and when they were doing it, and they put this whole thing in place. All right, well, you're doing the Lord's work out there, Melinda, and of course this on July 6th will be the 15th anniversary, if you can believe that, of the
I can't believe it. Yeah.
meltdown in Santa de la Guerra Plaza, and you have certainly deserve great praise and all respect for the work that you do, and trying to fill the gap that was that has been lost, and as I think all the journalists in Santa Barbara struggled to do. So,
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you for amplifying what all of us are doing. You're having reporters on your show and talking about the news. It's great.
wow. All right. Well, listen, thanks again. Have a great holiday, and keep up the good work. And we'll be looking for your next 1,500 word opus on the cannabis industry, with 6 photos to come. Thanks, Melinda Burns.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you very much.